Okay, so welcome to our colloquium today. I'm Bob Norwood, standing in for our usual Master of Ceremonies, Scott T.O. And I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Michelle Povinelli from University of Southern California. Michelle is the Wise Gabilan Assistant Professor in the Ming Tse Department of Electrical Engineering at the University of Southern California. She's already amassed some great awards: NSA Career Award, Army Research Office Young Investigator Award, Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and she, most importantly, was in the TR35 Award for Innovators Under Age 35 from MIT's Technology Review. Having been at MIT, I value that award the most. She received a BA from Chicago, and also from Cambridge, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD from MIT, all in physics. And she's going to talk to us about some really interesting work on how light interacts with nanostructures, particularly as applied to photovoltaics and light-assisted self-assembly. So, Professor Povinelli.
Thank you. Hi, so thanks for the invitation to come and speak here today. Unfortunately, I have a cold, so my talk will be punctuated by coughs. But in between, I'm hoping to tell you two stories today, both of which have to do with the basic physics of light interaction with nanostructure. So in my group, we generally study nano and microphotonics, and we're interested in how light interacts with nanostructured materials and devices. And as you'll see today, the applications of this field can be fairly diverse. So I'm first going to spend some time telling you about the work that we're doing in nanostructured photovoltaics. And then secondly, I'll be telling you about something I call light-assisted self-assembly, where we're looking at the intersection of nanophotonics and materials fabrication. Okay. So even in nature, there are a number of naturally occurring nano and microstructures that manipulate the ways in which we see light. So two pretty examples, or beautiful examples, are the butterfly wings and peacock wings. Both of these get their color from structural color. So unlike our t-shirts or most of the colors you see in this room, where the color is coming from dyes, in both of these animals, it's microstructure on either the wing or the feather that's responsible for reflecting different colors of light differently, so that we in one case see blue and in another case see the colors of the peacock wing. So these have been around, in nature all along, but ever since the advent of circuit technology or integrated circuit technology, people have had the capability to make structures something like this in the lab. So if we look at different examples of man-made structures, this is just showing two. It's illustrating, this is a micron scale bar here, that there are a variety of methods that we can use to make nano and microstructured materials. These both happen to be semiconductors. So on the left, you have a picture. This is showing an example of the growth of 3-5 semiconductor materials. You can see these ordered arrays of nanowires, which were produced by a combination of E-beam lithography for patterning and then MOCVD growth. We also have etching tools, so you can start in this case with silicon, and again use lithographic methods to define patterns, and then etch into the materials to define nanostructures, creating the whole pattern shown. So as you can see, I chose two examples of periodic structures on this slide. One's rods and one's holes. And in this talk, I'm going to be telling you about two applications, both of which rely fundamentally on the electromagnetic modes that structures like this support. So in particular, the basic physics that I'll be exploiting is the transmission properties of these 2D periodic structures. So on the left, we have cartoon rods or cartoon nanowires. And if we consider light that's incident normally on these structures, then we know that light can come in, it can interact with the modes supported by the structure and then come out. And similarly for these patterned hole structures. So the basic piece of physics that I want you to know about before I describe the applications is the existence of what are called guided resonance modes. So these are features of periodic materials, either rods or holes, and here I'm plotting holes as an example. So what this is that normal instance transmission, just like you saw in the last slide, shining light at normal instance and looking at what passes through. And in this case, if you look at this transmission spectrum as a function of frequency, you can see these strange shapes that show up. So you have dips, right? You have a number of dips, but they're not normal Lorentzian dips. In fact, they have these Fano line shapes where they go up and then down, or down and then up in the manner shown. And so these transmission line shapes have been pointed out in the past, and they've been explored both theoretically and in experiments. And we're going to be making use of those today. But what we want to know, in addition to the transmission features, is what the modes look like themselves. So if we take a look, in particular, at the frequencies where these dips are, and we look at what the light is doing, that's shown on the right. So here's a side view. In this case, this particular simulation, the slab is here. It's silicon. It's sitting on a silica substrate, and in this particular simulation, there's water above. The light's coming in from below. This is showing a single hole. And this is plotting an electromagnetic field intensity at this frequency where you have a dip. And what you can see is that at this frequency, light comes in, but it builds up right near the slab. So right in the vicinity of this slab, you have a strongly resonantly enhanced field, and you get a lot of light right in the vicinity. Now, this is a cross-section taken this way through the slab. If we look down from the top and we look just at one of these holes, and we look at the top, if you pick different frequencies or different dips here, and you look at the field profile E squared, this is the hole, and the color is showing E squared, then for different dips, you'll get different field profiles. But in all cases, you have a field that's resonantly enhanced near the slab. All right, so this brings us to the two stories that I want to tell today. And that's how this same basic piece of physics of guided resonance modes is useful for two different applications. In the first one, I'll be looking at these nanowire structures, so 2D periodic arrays of rods. And the key for these structures, these are nanowire solar cells. If you think about what a solar cell does, it has to absorb light and convert it to current. So I'll be telling you about how the resonant modes of this structure help us boost the absorption, giving, in fact, better performance for these structures than for solid films. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to be telling you about something seemingly very different in terms of applications, and it's what an idea I've proposed called light-assisted self-assembly. And there the idea is that we're again shining normally instant light on this 2D patterned slab, in this case of holes. But here we're using this slab to create optical forces on particles in solution. And these optical forces will cause the particles to line up and assemble in patterns, which we can control by controlling the instant light. So I'll start with the solar cell work. And just to give you some general motivation for solar, many of you have heard perhaps quite a bit of hype around solar recently. And there's a lot of attention to solar research. Solar is in the news, but it's important to point out that solar is still making up a very small portion of our electricity production. This happens to be 2004 data, but from this data you can see that in fact renewables altogether are only making up 2% of our electricity production. And out of that, solar is only 1% of the renewable energy. So solar is still not providing much of our energy needs. Despite this, there is a lot of light. So in fact, you can convert the amount of light that's available to a land area, and some of you may have seen this map before. What this is saying, okay, suppose we actually wanted to produce all of the electricity that we use in the US by solar. How much land area would it take? So in fact, if you covered a square as big as this yellow square, this would produce the energy needs of the US. With a more modest square, you could take care of a tenth of the population, so 30 million people's energy needs. So there's quite a lot of light out there, and the amount of area that it would require to provide our energy needs is not too crazy, and yet solar is not really being used for much of our energy. And there are two major bottlenecks. They're cost and efficiency. So these play out in different ways depending what you're using solar energy for. This is a picture of a large-scale installation where you would have a solar installation for utility scale, and here's residential. In both cases, you care about how much it costs to buy the panels and install them, and you also care about how efficient they are. If you're on the top of your house, for example, you want to make sure that you can supply the entire house just from the surface area of your roof. And in that case, how much light each panel is producing per square foot becomes important as well. So a lot of current research is trying to ask whether there's any science that we haven't used yet, or any scientific ideas that we haven't used yet, that might potentially provide benefits either on cost or efficiency or both. What we are doing, and what my group has been doing as part of our Center for Energy Nanoscience at USC, has been trying to figure out if we can exploit nanostructured materials to do better in this regime. So the basic idea that we're looking at is the idea of structural absorption engineering, or whether we can use nanopatterning to absorb more light in smaller volumes. So here's our cartoon solar cell. Your solar cell absorbs light from the sun and then has to generate a current in the external circuit. We are looking at what happens when you structure the absorber itself and how structuring the absorber can help you shrink the material usage, ultimately reducing cost. My focus has been on nanowire cells. Nanowire cells have been made both in silicon and in 3-5 semiconductor materials. And you can see from these pictures that it's possible to fabricate very ordered arrays of these nanowires. Here again, the scale bar is a micron. So we're looking at wires that are, more than 100 times smaller than your hair diameter, and looking at how ordered forests of these nanowires can be used to beneficially absorb light in small volumes. So in terms of modeling goals, what I've been looking at is using electromagnetic simulations and electromagnetic modeling to identify mechanisms that help increase broadband absorption in these materials, as well as predict or determine the limiting efficiencies of our devices, and in so doing help interpret experiments. Of course, in experiments you have a number of factors which can degrade the efficiency or contribute to loss, and so we are both trying to map out the best possible optimal structures and then help interpret actual experiments to determine where losses occur. So in this talk I'm going to focus on our work in silicon. We've worked both in silicon structures for single junction cells and in 3-5 structures for multi-junction cells. But today I'll look at the silicon. And I'm going to tell you about two results that we found where we're looking at the optical physics of these structures to identify mechanisms that increase solar cell efficiency. And one of these is simply optimizing the structures to have optimal lattice constants. And then secondly, I'll be moving from these regular or periodic structures to deliberately aperiodic structures, and showing that by taking your system and making it aperiodic, you can improve performance. So in terms of methods, we calculate as a first estimate of efficiency something I'll call the ultimate efficiency. So this quantifies the broadband absorption of a structure. It's for solar, so you want to absorb the entire solar spectrum. So as a result, we calculate an integrated value that depends both on the solar spectrum, I. The absorptance is a function of wavelength of our structure, and this weighting factor provides an upper bound on efficiency, assuming that one electron hole pair is generated per incoming photon, and that ideally you could collect all the carriers in your external circuit. So we then carry out accurate numerical calculations of absorption for real structures using parallelized codes, which we run on the USC supercomputer, using methods that include transfer matrix methods and finite difference time domain methods. So to show you how this works, if we start with a periodic silicon nanowire arrays, we take our simulation geometry shown on the left. In this case, for such a structure, it's important to define a filling ratio. The filling ratio is the area occupied by the wire compared to the area of the cell. And in this case, we're looking at relatively short heights of silicon. The general idea here is that we're seeing whether we can use structure to reduce the total height of material required. So this height, 2.3 microns, is actually not normally enough to absorb all the light. If we look on the right at the optical constants for intrinsic crystalline silicon, you'll see that the absorption length is shown in blue. In this range here, shown in yellow, from about 650 up, the absorption length is actually bigger than 2 microns. So in here, this is not tall enough to absorb the light. But by taking advantage of structural design, we will trick the structure into absorbing it anyway. Okay, so when we calculate our figure of merit, which was the ultimate efficiency, we need something to compare to. And so we compare our nanowire structures to thin films. So here, these are ultimate efficiency calculations. The thin film gives an efficiency of 14%. If you simply AR coat the thin film, you can do better, and you have a number slightly above 20%. But now, all these colored lines are showing different nanowire structures, and the different colors correspond to different filling ratios. And here, these are different lattice constants. But what you'll notice is that for any of the data points up here, any of these nanowire arrays have higher efficiencies than the thin film. And this is kind of cool, because you have less absorbing material. Remember, the silicon is absorbing the incoming light. So we've taken a material, we've removed, in some cases, more than half, up to half of it. You remove half of the absorbing material, and you actually do better than before. And the reason that this happens is because of the optical modes and optical properties of this periodic structure. So if we look at the spectrum, we can see two trends. Remember, we want good absorptance over the whole solar range, so ideally all these curves would be at 1. So when you take a thin film, you get the data shown in gray. Thin film absorbs okay, about up to 0.6. Not so well in this range where the absorptance is low. If we use nanowires with a smaller lattice constant shown in red, then you do very well up here in the low wavelength range, but not so well down here in the high wavelength range. As you start increasing the lattice constant, we see two things. First of all, there's an overall spectral shift. So just by going to larger lattice constants, same total amount of absorber, same filling ratio, but larger lattice constant, you shift your whole spectrum over. And that has to do with the fact that larger lattice constants focus the light more within the rods compared to the air. And as you keep going up to 500, you see the emergence of these guided resonance peaks. So this brings us back to the guided resonance modes that I introduced at the beginning of the talk. All of these spikes here, or increases in absorption, this enhancement in absorption is coming from the fact that light can come in and excite those modes that are strongly localized inside the nanowires. Those localized modes produce high absorption and give you improved performance. So once we saw that, in fact, nanowires absorb more light than solid films, our next question was whether moving the nanowires around can help. And so we looked at optimal design of aperiodic structures. So the basic question is just whether aperiodic structures enhance absorption. And what we did here is that we used random walk optimization to maximize our figure of merit, which was that ultimate efficiency was an integrated absorption over the whole spectrum. So we start with an initial structure, which is periodic. And then this here defines a supercell. We can't simulate an infinite aperiodic structure. So we let the rods or wires inside this cell move. So this is a structure over here, shows the same cell repeated 4 times. And we let the structure evolve. And after 1,000 iterations, we get a regular structure, like shown here. And this one actually has a 100% increase in ultimate efficiency compared to the periodic structure. So if you take your wires and you move them around, they absorb twice the light, integrated over the spectrum. And why is that? Well, it turns out that not only do periodic structures support these guided resonance modes, aperiodic structures support an analog of the guided resonance modes, and that's shown here. So if we pick one wavelength to look at and we plot the optical intensity, then our periodic structure has a very uniformly distributed intensity at that wavelength. But when you allow the rods to move around, you create hotspots of intensity in different locations in the structure. And these hotspots also give you resonant enhancement of the field, which gives you resonantly enhanced absorption. So these absorption peaks will result from these spatially localized resonances, as we can see on the next plot. So here we're comparing the thin film again to the initial periodic structure, shown here. And then when you take this periodic structure and move the rods, you see, first of all, this large increase, so 100% increase in ultimate efficiency. It's more absorptive than the thin film. And also, thirdly, this red absorptance spectrum looks like a periodic array with a larger lattice constant. So if you remember back to several slides ago, if you compare this red spectrum to the blue spectrum you saw here, this was a periodic array with a larger lattice constant. So by making the structure aperiodic, we've mimicked that spectrum. We have both an overall spectral shift, and we have the emergence of these peaks that are coming from the analog of guided resonance modes in the aperiodic structure. Yeah. So we did this initial work on nanowire structures, and then in my lab we decided to do experiments to test this result. And in this case, we decided to use holes, which exhibit similar physics. So we looked at both periodic arrays of holes in silicon, randomly arranged sets of holes, and also optimized structures where we evolved the hole positions using a optimization algorithm to yield a structure with a higher overall figure of merit. And so the actual fabricated structures are shown here. These are made by electron beam lithography and reactive ion etching in silicon membranes. We then measured the reflectance and transmittance of these structures in the 600 to 1,000 nanometer range. And the results are shown here. We got a very good match between theory and experiment. So over here on the theory side, this is showing the reflectance, both from the periodic structure in red. You see that the average, or, average aperiodic is actually, it's a typical aperiodic structure, but not optimized. Does a little bit better. The reflectance is a little bit lower, higher in some places. Aperiodic structure is shown. And you see very good qualitative agreement between the theory and the experiment. We then also measured transmittance, and you can see a reduction in transmittance as you go from the periodic structure to the aperiodic structure. So when we look at the absorptance, which is given by 1 minus T minus R, we see the following. Again, we get a very good match. So the periodic structure has a relatively low absorption, shown in red. By taking those holes and moving them around, we could increase the absorption across the whole range. And then by further optimizing the hole position, we get a further increase in absorption. And this is the theoretical trend, but you see that we also observe this in the experiment. So this experiment is kind of neat, and then it directly demonstrated the finding that we had computationally, that merely by taking a periodic structure and disturbing the periodicity, you change, and in this case, increase the overall broadband absorption of the structure. Now you may ask why this is the case. It's helpful to look in this case at Fourier space. So just to quantify the improvement you saw in the last slide, our overall absorptance figure of merit for the periodic structure we started with was 5.6%. By randomizing the hole positions, you increase to 18, and optimizing, you get 33. At the same time, if we look at what's happening in Fourier space, below this is simply the spatial Fourier transform of our dielectric structure. So if you have a completely periodic structure, the Fourier transform is periodic. But as you start to disturb the order, you get a more filled-in or uniform Fourier space picture. And in our optimized aperiodic structure, you have a much more uniform one. And so we've observed, both in this experiment and in previous work that we did with pattern recognition and machine learning, that in general, this increase or improvement in absorption behavior is correlated with small spatial Fourier components of the structure. In other words, for periodic structures, if you make the period bigger, it seems to improve absorption. For aperiodic structures, if you make the small spatial Fourier components corresponding to large length scales bigger, then you also improve the absorption. So far I've been telling you about aperiodicity and absorption. We've also looked at aperiodicity in another context, and that's for anti-reflection. So in this case, I'm not going to look at absorption. I'm just going to look at aperiodic textures on top of a solar cell. So typically, on standard cells, employ surface texturing to reduce the reflection from the top surface. But as you go towards thin film cells, the feature size of this texturing is too large. So for thin film cells, there's been interest in these nanostructured coatings, and people have made both periodic and aperiodic coatings on top of cells. And the question I wanted to ask was simply, if you're making an AR coating, is periodicity or aperiodicity something that we should worry about? Now, clearly, if you were in an effective medium picture, if all that mattered is the average index of this coating, then it wouldn't matter. But we aren't necessarily. These feature sizes are comparable to the wavelength in the solar spectrum over some range of the spectrum. And so, in fact, periodicity or aperiodicity can matter. So I chose a system in which we could, in a systematic way, look at this effect of aperiodicity in the coatings. And that was to, again, look at wires. But now we're looking at very short wires, and these are just serving as a coating now. So we looked at periodic, disordered, slightly disordered, and then quite disordered, either randomly disordered or optimized structures. And for simplicity, in this case, we're looking at semi-infinite substrates. Again, we can't simulate an infinite cell, so there are periodic boundary conditions on this cell. And here the height is just 120 nanometers. So the first thing that we did was simply optimize the periodic coating. If you have a periodic structure, you can ask what the best diameter to lattice constant ratio and lattice constant are in order to minimize the reflection loss. The reflection loss is, again, weighted by the solar spectrum, and it's telling you how many photons you lost due to reflection compared to how many were available to be absorbed by silicon. And you can perform this optimization. We identify the optimal diameter and lattice constant. So once we know this, we could look at the role of aperiodicity. And so this plot is a little complicated. I'll walk through the lines one by one. This is our figure of merit, which is reflection loss. And in this case, we want it to be low. You don't want to lose light off the top. So we are looking down here. We want to minimize the reflection loss. So first, if you look at the green line is showing you periodic structures. And you see that you do best, you minimize the loss when your lattice constant is 250. Okay. So now let's compare the green line with the red line. The red line is if you just take your coating wires and move them around randomly. What happens? Well, over here, if your initial periodic structure was kind of bad, not optimum, then moving stuff around randomly helps you and your loss goes down. Over here, if your periodic structure was really very good, then moving things around randomly and disrupting them tends to make your loss worse. So comparing these two lines tells you that aperiodicity can either help or hurt. It depends if you were near the optimum. So aperiodicity can improve or degrade performance depending on initial lattice constant. If you have a good thing already with your periodic structure, you don't want to mess it up. But if your periodic structure was, for whatever reason, not optimal, disorder tends to help. However, if you deliberately optimize your structure, the story is different, and that's shown by the purple line. The purple line is showing a deliberately optimized aperiodic structure, and that shows you that you can get performance improvements. So the optimized aperiodic structure is generally best. So to conclude this part of the talk then, for silicon nanowires, we've observed, first of all, that optimized nanostructured materials, in this case nanowire arrays, are more absorptive than thin films. So this very fundamentally establishes the benefits of nanostructure in terms of broadband absorption, that you can absorb more with less material provided that you take into account how it reflects, transmits, and traps light within the structure. And secondly, we've shown that in certain cases, if you use aperiodic structures, you can significantly enhance either absorption in one case or anti-reflection. And we've seen the absorption behavior now in theory and also directly verified that in experiment. So with this in mind, you've seen now one story about how knowing about the electromagnetic modes that you can excite with light in these structures give you benefits in performance. In this case, the existence of those modes told us that we should make sure to design our structures to have the right dimensions to support highly absorptive modes. And that you can do that in two ways. You can make relatively big rods, and they'll support the type of absorptive modes that enhance performance. Or you can move your rods around in a way that give you modes of aperiodic structures that support enhanced absorption, and again, give improved photovoltaic performance. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to switch gears completely and tell you about something else you can do with these same modes. And as I mentioned, I'll be switching from the wire structures, which were 2D periodic wire arrays, to these 2D periodic hole arrays. And the application will be different. So this was an idea which I proposed back in 2011. And I like to call this light-assisted templated self-assembly. The schematic shown here. The idea is that you could take a template, in this case this is silicon with holes in it, shine light at it, and that by doing this, if you have particles above it that are floating in solution, we could force those particles to assemble in crystalline patterns on the surface. So the thing I like about this idea is that if you're familiar with normal colloidal self-assembly, you may know that if you just let particles settle down on their own on a surface, you are forced by energetic constraints to always get hexagonal close-packed structures. So you get the structures where the balls just fit together. And that's because these self-assembly processes are determined by some free energy landscape, and you're minimizing that free energy when you form. However, if you have light here, and this light is coming in, and the light is, in fact, not just perturbing the system, the light is forcing the system. You have optical forces on particles. You can create particle assemblies that you wouldn't otherwise get. So in this case, in the picture, I'm showing a square lattice as one example of something you can create using this method. But more than that, you can not only make these novel patterns that you wouldn't otherwise get, but you can reconfigure them because you have a tunable light source. So if we change our light wavelength or light polarization, as we'll see, we can reconfigure these and get different crystalline patterns. So in a way, you can think of this as a programmable or reconfigurable optical matter, in that we are reconfigurably building up arrays of, or this 2D nanostructured material on the surface of our template. So there's been significant previous work done in the area of optical forces near photonic crystals and other microphotonic devices. So there was pioneering work done on trapping near microphotonic waveguides. Here this is a slot waveguide, and it was shown that this slot waveguide creates forces on particles. The particles get drawn down into the slot. There has also been trapping near photonic crystal microcavities. However, this previous work in the area of trapping in microphotonics has generally considered traps of single or a few particles. And the idea has been for precise manipulation of these single particles. What I wanted to do in this work is ask if we could use these types of effects for a very different purpose, and that is not to trap and manipulate single particles, but to build up synthetic crystals. So to do that, I realized that you could exploit the fact that we have different field patterns at these different guided resonance modes. So you saw this slide earlier. This is showing the photoresonances that occur in the transmission spectrum through a slab. You have local field enhancement. And in the case of optical forces, it turns out that the fact that you have strong field intensity here, which decays away from the slab, actually creates a gradient force which pulls particles down towards the surface. Then if you look in the plane at the different resonance patterns, these different modes will turn out to have different lateral force profiles, which give us different particle patterns. So we first calculated optical forces using Maxwell's stress tensor. So we get the fields from simulations and then use those fields to calculate forces on particles. And the main point that I want to make from the calculation is the importance of resonant enhancement. So this is a zoomed in picture of 3 of those transmission resonance peaks. And what you'll see here in the force calculation is that anywhere that you have a transmission resonance, you also see an enhancement in the vertical force. This force is shown for two different positions, in the center of a hole and at the corner, but it's important to note that the force is attractive. So these forces are pulling particles down towards the slab. And that's due to in general, that's due to the decay of field intensity away from the slab. So if we compare to radiation pressure is just a pushing force. This force on the particle above the photonic crystal has dimensionless magnitude of about 0.1. This is c, the speed of light, and phi is the flux. Compared to the radiation pressure that you would get without any of this stuff there, you have a resonant enhancement. You have an attractive force that it's 5 orders of magnitude bigger than radiation pressure. And that's for the particular case shown here. If you go to higher quality factor resonances or design your slab differently, we can increase this number. Okay, so if we look at the frequency dependency, I mentioned that the idea is we could use different modes to get different trapping patterns. So here, this is just one hole. This is the intensity in the plane. And here, this is a Z cut, so this is now showing you the force down. The slab is here. You see that in all three cases, the forces are down towards the slab. And then if we look in the plane, we can look at the force map in the plane to see where the stable positions of the particles would be. So this is the calculated stable position. So in this case, we can identify stable points shown by these red dots. And you can see that the pattern of the red dots changes in the three cases. So in principle then, if you tuned your laser to these different wavelengths, you would get particles lining up at the red spots, which are different depending what wavelength you pick. Moreover, you can also tune the polarization of your beam. So if we initially have an instant polarization like this, and this would give us the particle position shown here, if we rotate the input polarization, we expect the patterns to rotate so that you could reconfigure the assembled crystal. And a neat thing here is that in principle you can get fairly complex unit cells. So this is a square lattice shown here, but here you have these dimer patterns in a square lattice. Here you have whatever this is, square lattice with a 2-atom unit cell. And by designing other templates, you could also get other patterns. So we first did some estimates of the required power. You can estimate stability conditions, and we concluded that we should be okay with maybe about 1 milliwatt per unit cell. So this is for some realistic numbers for our slabs and for a quality factor of our resonance of about 300. So we went ahead and did this. We made silicon photonic crystals at USC using, again, e-beam lithography and reactive ion etching. This shows some of the various patterns that we have made, both top views and side views. You can see the etching. And then we characterize these to measure the resonances first. So we use a measurement setup shown here. So the measurement setup can be operated either forward or reverse. Basically, our sample sits here on a stage, an XYZ stage. And we can either feed the input through an optical fiber, a lens, a polarizer, through a microscope objective, focus it down on the sample. On this side, we have a detector, but we also have optics that lets us, there's a light source coming in and there's a camera, so we can look at the sample while we're doing this. And so using this setup, we can measure the resonances. I have to pause here. Up to this point in the talk, I've been telling you that these resonances show up as asymmetric dips that look like this. And now, finally, when we get to measured data, you'll see a different shape. So let me tell you why. Those dips, which you saw in previous calculated slides, had an asymmetric Fano shape. We measure our resonances in cross-polarization. When you measure them in cross-polarization, those resonances just show up as peaks. So here, these peaks are the modes that I talked about earlier. So here's a measured transmission spectrum as a function of wavelength, and we show that we can make square lattices with Qs in the 200 to 300 range, and we can control the wavelength of our resonance by adjusting our fabrication parameters. We've also shown that we can make very high Q resonances, so if anyone here happens to know this area well, These are actually state-of-the-art Q values in water. So we've measured in the graphite lattice, Q is as high as 9,800 in air and 5,000 in water. Okay. So using this then, we went ahead and we carried out the trapping experiment. And what I'm showing you here is our data from the first demonstration of this light-assisted templated self-assembly process. So you start out, you have some particles in solution. You can see the photonic crystal in the background. And as time goes on, the particles start to fill in. And they're filling in here because that's where the beam spot is. So we have a finite-sized beam occupying this area. And you can see that they build up into this square lattice. And then when you turn the light off, they're released. So to see how that happens, we'll look at the video. And this is sped up. So we deliberately used a very low concentration of particles here to get a good image. If you use a higher concentration, there are particles in between you and the objective, and it's more blurry. So this is a sped up video. It actually took about an hour. But what you can see is that particles are diffusing in. They join the cluster. They're building up in this ordered square lattice pattern. And slowly, they start to diffuse, fill in the gaps, until you get a very regular array or ordered array of particles. And eventually, as this video goes, it will completely fill in and occupy the central region of the beam. So in this experiment, we've built this 2D crystal. These are polystyrene particles with 500 nanometer diameter. And the lattice constant here is about 820 nanometers. The light we're using is 1.5 microns. So this is all sub-wavelength. And the particles are a little bit smaller than the lattice constant. And not only can you build these up, but it's reversible. So in the next video, we have an assembled cluster, and we simply turn the light off. And as soon as you turn the light off, they will disperse and go away again. So this is the first demonstration. As I mentioned earlier in theory, if we're able to design our structure to have another mode nearby, we could then, for example, tune our wavelength to a nearby wavelength and assemble a different pattern or different arrangement of particles, and then repeat that in a reversible way. Okay. So in conclusion then, we've proposed this idea that you could use light to assist self-assembly processes. And it relies on the fact that you have a resonant enhancement of forces that comes from guided modes of photonic crystals. You can assemble different 2D periodic particle patterns. And in principle, by tuning the light input, the frequency or polarization, you can reconfigure these particles to have a form of programmable or reconfigurable matter. So we've achieved the first experimental demonstration using polystyrene particles. We're also interested in being able to do this with a range of other different particles. For example, metal particles are of interest in order to be able to assemble plasmonic or metamaterial substrates. And in terms of applications, now that we've demonstrated this, we're starting to think about the things you could do with these techniques. One technique is simply to use this as a way of doing nanofabrication. So using this method, right now we're assembling particles and letting them go again. However, if we were to assemble particles in a background solution that could be polymerized or hardened, we could use this within a microfluidic device to make a region, solidify it, and then move on and make more, and in this way to fabricate 2D photonic crystals or other 2D metamaterial or plasmonic structures. Alternately, this whole thing is in itself a reconfigurable or tunable optical element. So in terms of integrated optics applications like filters and sensors, the fact that you can use optical forces to controllably add to your structure or remove from your structure could be used as a way of tuning it to get reconfigurable filtering or transmissive elements. And lastly, we're also starting to explore possible ideas in biological trapping that we could, for example, bring in biological species, allow them to interact in a controllable way, and then release them again. And that would be done in such a way that you had controlled spacing or controlled interactions. So this might be of interest for the study of spatially mediated interactions. Okay, so in conclusion then, I told you about two different subjects today. First part was about nanowire solar cells and engineering the absorption of these structures. And then secondly, light-assisted self-assembly, which relies on optical forces. But it's two examples of things that I'm interested in my lab that have to do with light interaction with nanostructure that share a same basic piece of physics. To briefly tell you about some of the other things we work on, these are the two other areas that I'm currently working on in my lab. The first is optomechanics. Optomechanics can mean a few different things, so let me explain what I mean here. By optomechanics, what I mean is optical forces between parts of integrated waveguides or integrated optical elements. And we're interested in this. The idea is that you can use light to move around waveguides. And once you can use the light to move around waveguides, you can use this for optical signal processing in integrated optics. So some time ago, I did some work showing that if you have two waveguides and you put light through the waveguides, that there is a force between them that can pull them apart or either pull them together or push them apart, depending what mode you excite. And so we are continuing to look at these types of ideas of being able to move structures. This picture happens to be of something we fabricated where there are photonic crystal devices on a movable membrane, which is connected by cantilevers. So this can move. And optical forces in these structures can move them around and change the response. And we're also interested in optical trapping in biology with our collaborator Noah Malmstad at USC. We've been doing work on measurements of cell membrane mechanics using dual beam optical traps based on optical fibers. That work's done using giant unilamellar vesicles. And for more information about either of those, I won't talk about those today, but you can look at our website. And I'd like to acknowledge the funding for the projects I talked about today. We're part of the DOE Energy Frontiers Research Center at USC, called the Center for Energy Nanoscience, which funds our solar work. And I'd like to acknowledge ARO PCASE Award for the work on material self-assembly, as well as the USC Computing Center. Thanks.